I watched my stepsister cradle the worn pink blanket against her swollen belly, cooing to her unborn child about Grandma's special gift, and something inside me finally shattered. That blanket, my baby blanket, the only thing I had left from my real mother, was being promised to her spawn while I stood there, invisible as always, in the corner of the living room during what was supposed to be a family celebration. "It's so soft," Jennifer gushed, rubbing the faded fabric against her cheek. "Mom, are you sure this feels really special?" My stepmother Patricia waved her hand dismissively, not even glancing in my direction. "Oh, it's nothing important. Just some old thing we had in storage. I thought it would be perfect for your nursery. Something vintage and loved." Nothing important. The words echoed in my skull like a death knell. That blanket had been hand-knitted by my mother during her pregnancy, every stitch infused with love and hope. She died when I was 3, and that blanket had been my only tangible connection to her warmth, her existence, her love for me. I'd kept it hidden in my closet, wrapped in tissue paper, taking it out only on my worst nights when the loneliness threatened to drown me. I opened my mouth to protest, but no sound came out. It was always like this. In this family, I had no voice, no presence, no worth. I was 23 years old, and I'd been nothing but a ghost in my own home for 20 years. "Aren't you going to congratulate your sister?" Patricia's sharp voice cut through my paralysis. She was looking at me now, her eyes cold and expectant. "Half-sister," I corrected automatically, then immediately regretted it when her expression hardened. "Family is family, Claire. Stop being so petty." She turned back to Jennifer, her face transforming into warm affection. "Don't mind her, sweetheart. She's always been jealous of you." Jealous? The accusation was so absurd it would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. Jealous of what? The love I'd never received? The attention that flowed to Jennifer like water while I withered from drought? The fact that in my father's eyes, his real daughter had died the moment he married Patricia and Jennifer entered our lives? That night, alone in my room, the smallest bedroom in the house, barely larger than a closet, I finally let myself cry. I clutched a photograph of my mother, the only one I had, and sobbed into my pillow until my throat was raw. The injustice of it all crushed down on me like a physical weight. They'd taken everything from me, my father's love, my inheritance, my dignity, my voice, and now they'd taken the last piece of my mother. I must have cried myself into some kind of breakdown because I felt something inside me crack, and then I was 7 years old again, standing in the hallway of our old house, watching my father introduce me to my new mother and sister. But this time, I remembered. I remembered everything. The realization hit me like a lightning strike. I had lived this life before. I had died. God, I had died at 35, alone in a psychiatric ward after my family had me committed for delusions and instability when I'd finally tried to fight back against years of financial abuse. I remembered the cold tile floor, the sound of Jennifer's laugh echoing down the hospital corridor during her single performative visit. I remembered dying with nothing, not even that precious blanket which Patricia had sold years ago at a garage sale for $2. I remembered the full, horrifying scope of what was coming. This wasn't just about a blanket. This was about 28 more years of systematic destruction. In my first life, I hadn't known I was a trust fund baby. My maternal grandmother, my mother's wealthy mother, whom I'd never been allowed to meet, had left everything to me when she died. But Patricia had convinced my grief-stricken father to let her manage my inheritance until I turned 25. By the time I discovered the truth at 28, the money was gone, funneled into Jennifer's business ventures, her dream wedding, her sprawling home. My father had been complicit, signing documents he never read, choosing his new family over his daughter's birthright. In my first life, I'd been so desperate for their love that I'd let them take everything. I'd worked 3 jobs to pay for my own community college while Jennifer attended an Ivy League school on my trust fund. I'd lived in that closet of a room while Jennifer had the master suite redecorated every other year. I'd been the unpaid nanny to Jennifer's children while she built a business with my inheritance money. And when I'd finally discovered the truth and confronted them, they'd called me crazy, ungrateful, delusional. They'd had me committed taken power of attorney and left me to die alone in that facility, convinced I was the problem, convinced I was insane. But I wasn't crazy, not then and not now. Now, standing in that hallway again as a 7-year-old girl with the mind and memories of a 35-year-old woman, I understood exactly what was at stake. This was my second chance. This was my opportunity to rewrite everything. I looked at Jennifer, 6 years old, gap-toothed, clutching a plastic doll, and saw not an innocent child but the woman who would systematically steal my life. I looked at Patricia, smiling her sweet, practiced smile, and saw the manipulator who would poison my father against me and embezzle my inheritance. And I looked at my father, who was watching his new wife with adoring eyes, already halfway gone from me, and I felt something inside me turn to ice. I would not be a victim again. Never again. "Hi," I said to Jennifer, my voice small and childlike, though my mind was already calculating, planning, strategizing. "Want to see my room?" The first few years were about survival and information gathering. I was a child in body, but not in mind, which gave me a peculiar advantage. I watched everything with an adult's understanding, noting every manipulation, every lie, every document that was signed. I kept a journal hidden in a hollowed-out book where I documented every instance of favoritism, every promise Patricia made to my father about treating the girls equally that she immediately broke. I was careful, so careful to appear normal. A traumatized child, perhaps, grieving her mother, but not threatening, not knowing. I let them think they'd won before the war had even begun. When I was 10, Patricia convinced my father to let her homeschool me to help with my emotional problems, while Jennifer attended private school. I pretended to be grateful, even as I recognized this as the first major move to isolate me. In my first life, this homeschooling had left me socially stunted and educationally behind, making it nearly impossible to compete with Jennifer later. But this time, I had the internet. While Patricia thought I was doing basic arithmetic workbooks, I was teaching myself advanced mathematics, computer programming, financial management, law. I consumed information voraciously, building the knowledge base I'd need to fight back. I took every free online course I could access. I read every book on trust law, inheritance rights, and financial fraud. By 12, I had a clearer picture of my situation than any adult in my life realized. I knew exactly how much money my grandmother had left me. $8.7 million, held in trust until my 25th birthday, managed by a board of trustees that included Patricia and my father. I knew that in my original timeline, this board had been manipulated into releasing funds for my education and welfare that had actually funded Jennifer's life. I needed evidence. I needed allies. And I needed to protect myself. When I turned 13, I did something that would have been impossible in my first life. I asked my father if I could attend Jennifer's school. I framed it carefully, tearfully, as wanting to be closer to my sister, wanting to make friends. Patricia tried to shut it down immediately, but my father, perhaps feeling a twinge of guilt at how completely he'd abandoned me, overruled her. It was the first battle I'd won, and it tasted like hope. High school was a careful balancing act. I needed to excel enough to build opportunities, but not so much that I'd threaten Jennifer or alert Patricia to my capabilities. I joined the robotics club, but let Jennifer take credit for the theater performances. I aced my standardized tests, but downplayed them at home. I built a network of teachers and counselors who saw my potential, people who would remember me, people who might serve as witnesses later. And I waited. God, how I waited. Because I knew the real theft wouldn't begin until I was closer to 25, when the trust fund would become accessible. But then something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Something that wasn't in my original timeline. My baby blanket. At 16, I overheard Patricia and Jennifer discussing Jennifer's upcoming wedding. Jennifer had gotten pregnant by her college boyfriend. This was new. In the original timeline, she hadn't married until 28, and Patricia was planning an elaborate wedding despite Jennifer's condition. "I've been saving something special for your first baby," Patricia said, her voice carrying down the hallway to where I stood, frozen. "Remember that vintage blanket I showed you, the pink one?" My blanket. Even though I was 16 in this timeline, they'd already stolen it. I'd hidden it so carefully, but Patricia must have found it during one of her cleaning sessions of my room. The rage that filled me was beyond anything I'd experienced in either life. This wasn't about money or inheritance or strategic planning. This was about the one thing, the single thing that was purely mine, purely my mother's love made tangible. And they'd stolen it to give to Jennifer's baby. That night, I made my decision. I couldn't wait until 25. I couldn't play the long game anymore. I needed to act, and I needed to act decisively. I had one advantage they didn't know about. I knew exactly what mistakes they would make because they'd already made them in another timeline. I knew Patricia's methods, her psychological tricks, her financial schemes. And I knew that in her arrogance, she'd always made the same crucial error. She documented everything, believing her paperwork would protect her rather than condemn her. At 17, I started my counteroffensive. First, I needed access to my own trust information. In my original life, I had been kept completely in the dark until I was almost 30. This time, I used the school library computers to research trust law to find the legal firm that managed my grandmother's estate. I drafted a letter, professional, polite, inquiring, introducing myself as the beneficiary and requesting information about my trust's status and management. The response came within a week, addressed to me at a P.O. box I'd opened, using a friend's address as my listed residence. The lawyers had been concerned, they wrote, about the unusually high number of disbursements from the trust. They'd asked Patricia and my father for documentation multiple times, but had received minimal cooperation. They wanted to meet with me, the actual beneficiary, to discuss the trust's status. I was 17 years old, still a minor, but the trust document specified that I had the right to request information and to petition for a change in trustees if I could demonstrate mismanagement. My grandmother, bless her, had been thorough. The lawyer's office was 2 hours away by bus. I told my father I was attending a school trip and used money I'd saved from secret tutoring jobs to make the journey. When I walked into that oak-paneled conference room, I was terrified but determined. The senior adsonica partner, Mr. Whitmore, was a distinguished man in his 60s who looked at me with kind, concerned eyes. "Miss Claire," he said gently, "we've been worried about you. Your grandmother left very specific instructions about your care and education. The trust was designed to ensure you had every advantage, but the disbursements we've been asked to approve, they don't align with those intentions." "Tell me everything," I said, and my voice was steady despite my shaking hands. What they told me was even worse than I'd remembered. Over the past 10 years, Patricia had systematically drained my trust. Not just for Jennifer's education, though that was substantial. She'd purchased 2 properties in Jennifer's name. She'd funded a business venture that had immediately failed. She'd bought luxury cars, taken international vacations, renovated their home, all under the guise of family expenses necessary for Claire's welfare and upbringing. The trust should have had $8.7 million plus growth. It now had $3.2 million. But here was the crucial difference from my first life. I had found out early. The money wasn't completely gone yet. And I had allies in the form of these lawyers who'd been growing increasingly suspicious of Patricia's requests. "What can I do?" I asked. Mr. Whitmore leaned forward. "You can petition the court to remove your father and stepmother as trustees. Given the evidence of mismanagement and the fact that you're approaching majority, a judge would likely appoint an independent trustee. But Claire, you need to understand, this will destroy your relationship with your family. This will be war." I thought about my baby blanket about to be given to Jennifer's child. I thought about dying alone in a psychiatric ward, convinced I was crazy, my entire life stolen. I thought about every moment of invisibility, every casual cruelty, every erasure of my existence. "They already destroyed my relationship with me," I said quietly. "They just don't know it yet." The legal process took 8 months. 8 months during which I had to live in that house, pretending everything was normal, while lawyers filed motions and subpoenaed documents. 8 months during which Patricia grew increasingly suspicious of my frequent study groups. And my father looked at me with growing confusion, unable to understand why his daughter was suddenly so secretive. Jennifer had her baby, a girl she named Emma, in November. Patricia made a big show of presenting my baby blanket at the hospital, wrapping it around Emma while Jennifer posted photos on social media, tagging it "Nat Heirloom Hat Family Tradition." I liked the photo, commented with a heart emoji, and said nothing, but I kept screenshots. Everything would be evidence. The court date was set for March, 2 months before my 18th birthday. Patricia and my father were served with papers at the breakfast table on a Monday morning. I watched from the doorway as Patricia's face went from confusion to shock to absolute fury. "What is this?" she hissed, her carefully maintained composure cracking. "Claire, what did you do?" My father looked between the papers and me, bewildered. "Honey, I don't understand. What's this about the trust?" "I'm petitioning to remove you both as trustees due to gross mismanagement and embezzlement of my inheritance," I said calmly, though my heart was racing. "You've stolen over $5 million from me over the past 10 years. The court will decide if criminal charges are appropriate." The explosion that followed was spectacular. Patricia screamed that I was an ungrateful, delusional child. My father sputtered about family and trust and how he'd only ever tried to do what was best. Jennifer, who'd driven over after a panicked call from Patricia, accused me of trying to ruin her life, of being jealous, of being mentally unstable. "You need help, Claire," Jennifer said, and there it was, the same accusation that would lead to my commitment in the original timeline. "This paranoia isn't normal. Maybe we should look into counseling." But I had expected this. I'd learned from my first death. "I have counseling," I said pleasantly. "My therapist has been documenting my mental health for the past year. She's prepared to testify that I'm completely lucid and that my concerns about financial abuse are not only rational, but justified." This was true. I'd been seeing a therapist through school, carefully building a paper trail of my sound mental state. I also have copies of every disbursement request Patricia made to the trust, along with evidence of where that money actually went. The house in Aspen that's in Jennifer's name? Purchased with my trust fund. The family vacation to Europe last year that I mysteriously couldn't attend because of my anxiety? Paid for with my money? Jennifer's car, her wedding, her business investment, all my inheritance. Patricia's face had gone white. "You can't prove any of that." "The trust lawyers have been documenting every request for 3 years. They've been suspicious for a long time. They're prepared to testify, and I have bank statements, property records, and business filings. Patricia, you didn't even hide it well. You just assumed I'd never find out and that if I did, no one would believe me." The court case was brutal but straightforward. Mr. Whitmore and his team presented a clear timeline of financial abuse. They showed how Patricia had manipulated my grieving father, how she'd systematically isolated me to prevent me from discovering the theft, how she'd spent my inheritance on her biological daughter while forcing me to live on the bare minimum. Patricia's lawyer tried to argue that all expenditures had been for family welfare and therefore included me as a family member. But the prosecution dismantled this quickly. How was a vacation I wasn't invited to for my welfare? How was a property titled only in Jennifer's name for my benefit? How were Jennifer's private school tuition and my isolation at home treating us equally? My father, to his credit, seemed genuinely shocked by the scope of the theft. In his testimony, he claimed he'd trusted Patricia completely, that he'd signed documents without reading them, that he'd been so lost in grief and then so focused on his new marriage that he'd failed his daughter. His realization, his regret, it came too late. It was genuine, perhaps, but it was 20 years too late. And it didn't erase the damage. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s who listened to everything with an expression of increasing disgust. When it was my turn to testify, she asked me directly, "Miss Claire, what do you want to see happen here?" I could have been vindictive. I could have pushed for criminal charges that would put Patricia in prison. But I'd learned something in my 2 lives. The best revenge isn't destruction, it's complete, undeniable success. I want my remaining inheritance placed with an independent trustee until I turn 25, as my grandmother intended, I said clearly. I want a full accounting and repayment plan for what was stolen. And I want Patricia and my father removed from any legal authority over me or my finances permanently. "What about your family relationships?" the judge asked, her tone gentle despite her harsh words earlier. I looked at Patricia, who was glaring at me with such hatred it was almost palpable. I looked at Jennifer, who was crying prettily, still trying to play the victim. I looked at my father, who appeared broken, finally understanding what he'd allowed to happen. "Your Honor," I said softly, I haven't had a family in a very long time. I'm just making it official. The judge's ruling was comprehensive. Patricia and my father were removed as trustees. An independent financial management firm was appointed to oversee my trust. Patricia was ordered to return specific assets, including the Aspen property, and to repay $2.8 million over 20 years with interest. If she failed to make payments, criminal embezzlement charges would be filed. My father was censured for negligence but not held financially responsible since he could prove he genuinely believed Patricia's representations about the money. However, he was ordered to attend financial literacy courses and parenting counseling, and I was granted emancipation, effective on my 18th birthday, which was now just 6 weeks away. But I wasn't done, not even close. The court case had been public and the local media had picked it up. Stepmother embezzles millions from orphaned stepdaughter, made for compelling headlines. Patricia's reputation in her social circles was destroyed. Jennifer's business, which had been built partially on my stolen money and partially on Patricia's connections, began to crumble as former associates distanced themselves. My father, devastated by the exposure of his neglect and the public scrutiny, filed for divorce from Patricia. It was messy, and in the settlement, he had to liquidate assets to help cover Patricia's repayment obligation to me. The house I'd grown up in, the house that contained all my worst memories, went on the market. I didn't attend my high school graduation ceremony. Instead, I was meeting with financial advisors, planning my future. The remaining $3.2 million in my trust, properly invested and managed, would grow substantially by the time I was 25. The repayment plan, if Patricia kept up with it, would restore much of what had been stolen. But more importantly, I was free. Legally, financially, emotionally free. I'd been accepted to MIT with a full scholarship based on my academic record and my compelling personal statement about overcoming adversity. I was leaving for Boston in August, and I would never return to that town, that house, that family. Except for one final thing. 3 weeks before I left for college, I drove to Jennifer's apartment. She'd moved into a small 2-bedroom after her husband left her. He'd apparently been unaware that his wife's lifestyle had been funded by embezzlement and wanted no part of the scandal. She answered the door, looking exhausted, Emma crying in the background. "What do you want?" she asked dully. "I want my blanket," I said simply. She stared at me for a long moment, then turned without a word. She came back carrying my baby blanket, now stained and worn from use, smelling of spit-up and diaper cream. "Take it," she said, shoving it at me. "Take everything. You've destroyed our lives. I hope you're happy." I held the blanket carefully, feeling the familiar texture of my mother's work beneath the layers of dirt and damage. "Jennifer," I said quietly, "I didn't destroy your life. You never had the life you thought you did. It was never yours. It was always mine, and your mother stole it. I just took back what was mine." "We're sisters," she said, and she was crying now. "Half-sisters, but still. How could you do this to family?" I thought about all the times I'd been invisible, all the times I'd been erased, all the times I'd been told I wasn't really family, that I was being petty for wanting any acknowledgement of our different treatment. "You're right," I said. "We are sisters, and maybe in another life, in another timeline, we could have been a real family. But in this life, your mother made sure that would never happen. She made her choices, and you benefited from them without question. You never once asked where all that money came from, did you? You never wondered why you had everything while I had nothing?" She didn't answer, but I saw the truth in her face. She'd known, on some level. She'd just chosen not to look too closely at the source of her good fortune. "Goodbye, Jennifer," I said, and I walked away carrying my blanket my mother's love finally reclaimed. I had it professionally cleaned and restored by a textile conservator who specialized in vintage fabrics. It cost $800, but it was worth every penny. When I unpacked in my dorm room at MIT that August, I folded the blanket carefully and placed it on my bed, a reminder of where I'd come from and what I'd survived. College was a revelation. I threw myself into my studies with fierce determination, majoring in computer science with a minor in business. I made friends, real friends who liked me for who I was, who had no agenda, who didn't use me as a convenient punching bag for their insecurities. I joined clubs. I went to parties. I dated. I laughed. I lived. And I excelled. By my sophomore year, I'd already developed an algorithm that caught the attention of several tech companies. By my junior year, I had internship offers from Google, Apple, and Microsoft. By my senior year, I'd co-founded a startup with two classmates, building on my algorithm to create Oinki, but a revolutionary data security platform. The startup took off faster than any of us expected. By the time I turned 25 and gained full access to my restored trust fund, which had grown to 6.7 million with proper management and Patricia's payments, my third of the company was valued at 23 million. I was a millionaire many times over by my own merit, not just by inheritance. I'd built something real, something mine, something no one could steal. On my 25th birthday, I did something I'd been planning for years. I hired a private investigator to locate my maternal grandmother's family, my family, the people Patricia had cut me off from when I was too young to fight back. It turned out my grandmother had had a sister, my great-aunt Margaret, who'd been searching for me for years. Patricia had blocked all attempts at contact, telling them I didn't want to see them, that I blamed them for my mother's death, that I needed space. All lies, of course. Margaret was 78, sharp as a tack, and when she opened the door and saw me standing there, she burst into tears. "You look just like her," she whispered, touching my face with shaking hands. "Just like my sister. Just like your mother." I'd found my family, my real family. Margaret told me stories about my mother that I'd never heard, showed me photos I'd never seen. I learned that my mother had been funny, adventurous, brilliant, a software engineer in the early days of the tech boom, which explained my own aptitude. I learned that she'd been so excited about my birth, had knitted that blanket during her final trimester, had planned for my future with joy and hope. I learned that she would have been proud of me. Through Margaret, I met cousins, second cousins, family friends who'd known my mother. I spent Thanksgiving with them, Christmas, Easter. I had birthday parties where people actually celebrated me, not just tolerated my presence while showering attention on someone else. I had family dinners where I wasn't the invisible afterthought, but the guest of honor, the brilliant young CEO they were. Proud to claim, I built a life that my mother would have wanted for me, a life that honored her memory and her love. By the time I turned 30, my company had gone public and my personal net worth exceeded 200 million. I'd been featured in Forbes, in TechCrunch, in interviews where I carefully crafted my story of overcoming adversity without revealing all the details of my rebirth. I bought a penthouse in San Francisco with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. I furnished it with beautiful things, including a custom display case for my baby blanket, preserved behind museum-quality glass where it would never be damaged or stolen again. I dated, had relationships, eventually fell in love with another tech entrepreneur who understood my drive and my past. We married in a small ceremony on the beach with Margaret and my mother's family surrounding us with genuine love and joy. I was happy, genuinely, deeply happy. And Patricia, Jennifer, and my father, I kept tabs on them, though they never knew it. Patricia had been forced to declare bankruptcy after struggling with the repayment plan. She'd lost everything: her social status, her wealth, her marriage, her dignity. She worked as a receptionist at a dental office, living in a small apartment, her life a shadow of what it had been. The court had garnished her wages for years to pay me back, and she'd never fully recovered. Jennifer had moved back in with Patricia after her divorce, working retail while trying to raise Emma alone. She'd never finished college, never built a career, never achieved any of the dreams that had been funded by my stolen money. Emma was a teenager now, and according to my investigators, Jennifer struggled constantly with money, with single parenthood, with the reality that her privileged youth had been built on a foundation of theft and lies. My father had remarried, a kind woman named Susan who, by all accounts, was genuinely good to him. He'd retired early from his job due to the stress of the scandal, and he lived modestly in a small town several states away. He'd written me letters over the years, all returned unopened. I wasn't interested in his apologies or his regrets. He'd made his choices, and he had to live with them. Some people might say I should forgive them, that holding on to anger was toxic, that I should let go. But here's what those people didn't understand. I had let go. I'd let go of them, of the need for their approval, of the fantasy that they would ever be the family I deserved. I didn't hate them. I simply didn't think about them unless I chose to. And when I did, it was with the distant curiosity one might have for characters in a story that had a happy ending for the protagonist and a well-deserved fall for the villains. On the 10th anniversary of the court case, I received a letter that wasn't from my father. It was from Jennifer. Unlike my father's letters, which I'd returned unopened, I opened this one out of curiosity. It was short, written in shaky handwriting. Claire, I won't ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I won't ask for money, though we desperately need it. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. I understand what Mom did to you, what we all did. I understand that we stole your childhood, your mother's memory, your future. I understand that the life I lived was never really mine. Emma asks about you sometimes. She saw an article about your company and realized we were related. She wants to meet you, to know her aunt. I told her it was impossible, that I had no right to ask that of you. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I know it means nothing, changes nothing, but I'm sorry, Jennifer. I read the letter 3 times, feeling nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no sympathy. Just a distant acknowledgement that this was the natural consequence of her actions, her mother's actions, her choices. I didn't respond, but I did set up a trust fund for Emma, my niece, who'd been born into a situation she couldn't control. The money would become accessible when she turned 18 with one condition. She had to have no contact with Patricia or Jennifer for 1 year before accessing it, and she had to maintain that boundary to continue receiving distributions. It was a manipulative move, perhaps, but I'd learned from the best. And unlike Patricia, my manipulation would give Emma a chance at a real life, a real education, a real future. Whether she took it would be up to her. Now at 35, the age I'd been when I died in my first life, I stood in my penthouse apartment, the city lights twinkling below, my husband's arms around me, and I thought about the 2 lives I'd lived. In my first life, I died alone, broken, convinced I was crazy, stripped of everything. In this life, I'd built an empire. I'd reclaimed my inheritance and multiplied it 100-fold. I'd found real family, real love, real success. The baby blanket, my mother's blanket, sat in its case across the room, a reminder of what had been stolen and what I'd taken back. But it was more than that now. It was a symbol of rebirth, of transformation, of the truth that you could start over, that you could rewrite your story, that you could refuse to be a victim. "What are you thinking about?" my husband asked, his chin resting on my shoulder. "About second chances," I said softly. "About how sometimes life gives you an opportunity to make things right, and you have to have the courage to take it." "Any regrets?" he asked. I thought about that question, really thought about it. Did I regret the ruthlessness with which I'd reclaimed my life? Did I regret destroying Patricia's world, causing Jennifer's downfall, forcing my father to face his failures? "No," I said finally. Not a single one. They stole everything from me once. I made sure they could never do it again. I made sure I never needed anything from them again." "Good," he said and kissed my temple. "You deserved better then, and you deserve everything you have now." And that, I thought, was the ultimate victory. Not just taking back what was mine, but building something so magnificent, so unassailable that no one could ever take anything from me again. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just living, but living well. They'd given my baby blanket to Jennifer, thinking I was too weak, too powerless, too broken to fight back. After my rebirth, I never asked them to keep anything again. I didn't have to ask. I simply took back everything that was mine and built a life they couldn't touch, couldn't taint, couldn't steal. And I lived happily, successfully, peacefully ever after, while they lived with the consequences of their cruelty. That was justice. That was revenge. That was rebirth. That was my story.